You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I'm your delegate host, Abraham.
And I'm your votes don't count host, Shane.
Oh my goodness. We are a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do and animals do and emotions that we have. And sometimes what we do is we talk about systems that we have put in place to try and oppress people inside of that system. So yeah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
This should be a super happy, light episode.
It will not. If you are joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here. We are happy to have you. We are going to today be talking about politics because politics is a thing that people do. And when it's a thing that people do, then we talk about why they do it. And that is psychology stuff. And that's why we're here.
Yay!
And if you end up liking what you hear in this episode today and would like to support us, you can join us over on Patreon. You can pick up some merch, leave us a rating and review, tell a friend, do all those things. But I'd also like to just wish you happy Spumoni Day.
Yeah. And also a happy Finance Brokers Day, I guess.
Do you know what Spumoni is? I had to look it up.
I have no idea.
Apparently, it's a layered Italian ice cream with fruits and nuts.
Oh, I support that then.
It is a Brazilian Blowout Day.
Of course it is. It's International Day of Remembrance and tribute to the victims of terrorism.
Oof, that's a heavy one to unpack.
Yeah.
It is Internet Self-Care Day, which I would interpret to mean get off the internet.
I would interpret it to mean that you take your internet to get a manicure.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, sure.
Yeah. It's National Medical Dosimetrist Day.
What is a dosimetrist?
Today is full of things that we didn't know about.
It is Poets Day.
Oh, so write your haikus. It is Senior Citizens Day. Speaking of the Electoral College.
All right. I had to look this up. A dosimetrist is a member of a radiation oncology team.
Okay.
Who oversees radiation treatment plans for cancer patients.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Wow.
Interesting.
Okay. Didn't know that was a thing. Relevant to Senior Citizens Day, as it were. People who are maybe more on the more likely end of the spectrum to be getting cancer. And we support our senior citizens. They're very important. And we care about them very much. And we definitely want to make sure that they are well taken care of.
We do.
All right. It is World Goat Day.
It is. I was going to say something. Now I don't know what I was going to say about it because it's just a day to celebrate goats, I guess.
Simone Biles Day?
It's Simone Biles Day. Yeah. Yeah. It is Drive Sober or Get Pulled Over week. Oh, I mean, that should be every week.
I was going to say, finally.
Yeah.
I thought that was just a law.
Yeah.
It is Minority Enterprise Development Week. That's cool.
It's National Aviation Week. So, get in that big metal tube and fly across the sky.
It is Little League World Series Day. Apparently, they do a World Series for Little League. Did you get to participate in that when you were doing Little League?
Almost.
Okay.
I was on a team that did pretty good, and we did not qualify. And that was like the last season of Little League I played before I went into like travel ball. So
okay, got it.
Yeah. It's also Hayden Panettiere's Day. Panettiere. Hayden Panettiere. Her birthday. It's her birthday.
Yeah.
Hayden.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, Hayden.
Long time friend of the show.
Uh-huh.
Just kidding. I wish. That'd be great.
Uh-huh.
All right. As we said, I think we said we were talking about, well, we didn't actually say. We said before we started rolling, but I don't think we've mentioned yet sorry, let me take a step back. In the United States, we are coming up on a major election to elect our president, a new president, at least from who the current president is, new in a sense. And interestingly, we don't know how it's going to turn out, largely thanks to the fact that we know that even if one of the candidates wins the majority of votes, and not just the majority, they could win a comically, gigantically huge margin of the majority of votes, they still might not become the elected head of state in the United States because of our system.
Yes. And so this may be a two-parter episode because we are going to unpack this horrific thing called the Electoral College. And it's a thing that has vexed many people, but I think the majority of people don't even understand what it is.
Yes, yeah, and I think we're tipping our hands a little bit by calling it horrific, but we're going to unpack this as straightforwardly as we can. We will be interspersing our own commentary. A lot of what we're going to do is we're going to dig into the history of the Electoral College. We're going to explain how the Electoral College works, and we're going to get into arguments that people have made for keeping the system as is, and arguments that people have made for changing it, and then some of like what's kind of going on in the world of the Electoral College. And so, as we said, we're calling it an Electoral College. You might just call it an electoral system, because an Electoral College is not a place.
Nope.
It's certainly not a college, at least not in the university sense of the world. It's like a college.
Certainly not
like
intellectual.
Yeah, definitely not intellectual. It's maybe collegiate in the sense that it's a group of people who are in a position to do something. But really, instead, the Electoral College is a process. And in the United States and in some other countries, it is a process by which our head of state in the United States, the president, is chosen by a system of votes.
And I think that starting with that sentence is already going to throw people off, because I think a lot of people think that when you vote, your vote counts towards that selection of the head of state. But the truth is ultimately the president is elected by the Electoral College, and we'll talk about that as we go. But like that is something that I think is really important to remember when we unpack this.
Yes, very much so.
So a long time ago, when people started living in communal groups so large that they became unmanageable, some very charismatic villains convinced people to make that villain the leader of the group and called that person a king, who would hold on to that power until they died, then abdicate to their next of kin. So, kings. Ugh, the worst.
I've definitely wanted for a long time for us to do a whole episode on monarchies and royalty, because it's such a fascinatingly bizarre system.
Especially the monarchies that believed in keeping their bloodlines limited. So like their family tree was just a trunk.
Yes. Yeah, that was a weird thing that happened. It's just a trunk. It's pretty good. All right. So there was that system. There were other versions of a system, but mostly what happened, these groups got large, they appointed a king. That king had absolute power and authority and would stay in power forever. That was largely how those systems existed. At some point, we decided that wasn't a very good system. For one thing, when they decide that they deserve that power, they start doing very crazy things, as has happened. And we'll talk about those at some point in the future when we cover royalty. But suffice it to say, it was not a very good system. And instead, many countries started asking the question, like, how else could we arrive at a leader that in a way that we think is fair? And so they started asking the people, the citizens of those countries, to cast a vote, to cast a ballot, to basically get together and collectively decide who they thought should become that country or that whatever government's leader.
Right. So somewhere along the way, some very cynical, conniving, elitist jerks, and for the purposes of this episode, we'll call them Federalists, they decided that the general public could not be trusted with the responsibility of choosing a leader because they were too stupid and because they didn't agree with the Federalists. But the idea was, they kind of touted it as the general population is not intelligent enough to be able to make a decision about who is going to lead them.
Right. So in several governments that wanted to have this brand of democracy where sort of it's run and chosen by the people, but not actually grant real power to the will of the people, they instead invented an electoral system in which, rather than citizens directly choosing their head of state, representatives would choose on their behalf. So there would be people that were already in power, and that group of people would then choose the overall leader who made policies who affected everybody.
Yeah, those are the folks that said, we know what's best for you.
Yes, exactly. And also, we don't care.
Yeah, that's what they would say. But then they would go, actually, we're voting on what's best for us.
Yes.
Yep.
Try and stop me.
Yeah, exactly. So, you can't even find the college, So, of course, when you are in a position of power and the extent to which you can keep or even expand that power rests not with how the public feels about your leadership, but how their representatives choose to vote, then there's a lot of incentive to win over the representative, not the people. So, basically, we're going to hold on to the folks that are going to keep us in power.
Yeah, so they would appeal more or less to the body of legislators, and they would maybe they'd promise to grant them privileges and to grant them power if they supported them in becoming president. And then it didn't really matter what the people wanted. There was just sort of these insider deals where the person who was president or wanted to be president would make some sort of, under the table elbow promises about getting other people power if they helped get that person elected. And so that was sort of what that system would look like. So for this and kind of many other reasons, most thriving democracies don't use an electoral system to choose their head of state. It's kind of considered in a way to be an archaic, unfair system, and it carries that potential for corruption because, as I said, the people in power can basically just do a lot of backroom swindling deals with other people who have power to ensure that they either secure power, maintain power, or expand their power.
Right. So in a democracy, we believe that the people should be able to choose their leaders and that their participation in the matter is counted equally with everyone. So one vote equals one person. Otherwise, a small handful of people get to wield heightened power to make legislative choices that affect the majority of people who did not choose to be subjected to that legislation. But we'll get into that in a little bit. We have digressed somewhat.
Yeah, just as you said, the point is somebody who was not chosen by the people is making policies for the people. And that is kind of the whole reason to move away from a system like a monarchy in the first place, right? So, all right, going back to the United States here. So in the United States, the founding fathers, the powers that be, if you will, were trying to figure out how we were going to choose these leaders. And there was a couple of ideas for how this might be done. And again, they didn't want a king. Well, some people did, but they were kind of trying to get away from this monarchy thing and instead move toward a democracy because the idea here was that we wanted freedom that we felt like we lacked in previous countries to which we belonged. And the only way to get that is through some kind of democracy. So one idea was that the voters would elect a Congress, and the Congress would then choose and elect the president, as we're sort of describing before, right? So the president entirely chosen by a Congress of people, and the Congress was elected by the people, but the president would then be chosen by the Congress. That is, voters would not get to elect the president at all, except by maybe hoping that the Congress people that they did vote for would elect a president that they wanted. However, hope is not counted in an election, just so we're clear.
Yeah.
There was no choice in the matter if the decision was to go with having Congress select the leader. The other idea was that qualifying citizens would elect the president as the head of state with a majority vote. Whoever received the most votes would become the president. But of course, there's the issue of a qualifying citizen who was specifically described as, quote, free white persons.
Yep.
This would be men only, and white men at that, because women did not have the power to do this. And I did see some allusions to the idea that they would have to be land owning and of good character as also potential qualifiers. So,
sure.
So still not super representative, still not really a democracy in that sense. But that was the ideas. The two ideas were either we win by a simple majority vote by the citizens, free white persons, or we have the Congress choose the president.
Yeah, and I think in those cases, having somebody elect something for you just feels off, like when we have to elect to play ads and you don't get a choice in the matter.
Okay, so we've been talking about this whole system of elections here, and the idea of either having Congress select the president so that the citizens had no say, or having citizens have all the say, this was not really acceptable to everybody, and particularly not necessarily enough to the powers that be. So instead, they settled on a compromise, an electoral system.
Yes. So according to Alexander Hamilton of Hamilton fame, that's what he's most famous for, is the musical Hamilton.
Yeah, at this point.
In the Federalist Paper number 68, the compromise was between states with large populations and small populations, with a fear that states with large populations would always control the presidency.
Okay, so let's just say that exact same sentiment using slightly different words. I want to make sure we're just we're just restating it so that we're all clear here. The people in the minority were afraid that the people in the majority would outvote them.
Yeah.
That was essentially what the compromise was. Well, just so we're clear, yes, that is how voting generally works. When we're like at a company gathering, like having a birthday party or something, and we're going to vote on the kind of ice cream we get for the company party, whatever it is, and the majority of people choose chocolate chip cookie dough, we don't then go to John and say, well, you didn't want this, so we're going to give you 5 extra votes so that you can make everyone else eat a coconut ice cream instead.
Right.
The whole idea with having people vote is that the majority wins, right? So,
right.
So yes, the people in the minority were afraid that they'd be outvoted by the people in the majority, which is what would happen because that's how voting works.
That's how voting works.
In every other system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, how scoring works in games. Whoever gets the most points wins. We don't say whoever does the worst in this game wins, because that would make no sense from a competitive standpoint. Just throwing that out there.
We also don't say, oh, because you belong to the minority, your points count more. Like, you don't get to shoot 3-pointers, you get to shoot 6-pointers.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't make any sense. We don't change the rules for single people.
Your team's not quite as good as our team, so we're just going to make it so that you get an advantage starting and your points count for more.
Right, exactly. Kind of going back to what we're talking about here. So they wrote into the Constitution that the president would be chosen by electors. It does not actually say Electoral College in the Constitution, just to be clear, for those folks that are going to show up in our comments as sovereign citizens or whatever you want to throw at us. It does not say Electoral College in the Constitution. Each state would get a number of electors equal to their congressional representation, 2 for their senators, every state gets 2 senators, and 1 for each of their House of Representative members. The 2 for the senators favor small states, who then get much more powerful representation for their individual votes. And the representatives favor larger states who have more people. So in this way, states would send electors to cast votes on behalf of the state. So essentially, the state has people who vote for the state.
Yes. Also, if you do the math really quick, that means that if you have a guaranteed 2 senators and you're going to have a minimum of 1 House of Representative person who's voted in, that means that every state's going to have a minimum of 3 electoral votes.
Right.
That's just how it has to work, because you're always going to get 2 for your senators and then 1 for every House of Representative member that you send to that chamber. And so every state gets a minimum of 3. Okay. That means that states that have very, 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 very few people, let's just say 6, they get those 3 electoral votes, even though states that have millions of people would not have a equal number of electoral votes where it would be proportional. So if one had 6 and one had 6 million, or one had 6 people, one had 6 million people, it would not then be that, like, for every 2 people in the state with 6 people that get a representative, every 2 people for the 6 million people would get a representative, coming down to a nice 3 million representatives. That's not how that works. The people who are in the small state would have way more power in their vote to choose people who then show up in the elections.
Right.
So that's essentially how the electoral system is set up. Just make sure we're really clear on that.
Right. So this was not at all clearly spelled out in the Constitution. So, and I think that's really important to remember here, because that's the whole thing with the Constitution, is like a lot of times it's kind of like interpreted and misinterpreted and all that fun stuff. So,
yes.
But let's unpack this for a second. So, for instance, what if an elector chooses not to vote how the majority of people in that state voted? The Constitution doesn't say that they have to vote with the majority of people. Do all the electors need to vote how the majority of the state voted, or should they distribute their vote proportionally relative to the constituents of the state? Your guess is as good as theirs. There is no guideline on that. But this wouldn't come up right away, so who cares? Let's just enshrine this into a nearly impossible to repeal law and hope for the best. And so they did. They basically just said, we're going to go with this. We don't have all the details yet, but like, this is definitely going to be a thing that we do.
Yeah, this is probably good enough, we think. So let's just not think about it anymore and make it a part of our Constitution. Very difficult to change.
Right. You have to have another amendment to change an amendment.
Correct. Yes. Okay. So most of the time, to be fair, like most of the time, what has happened with this system is that the majority of the population of a state voted for a candidate to become president. Most of the states voted the same way. All of the relevant electors were allocated to that candidate, and the candidate went on to become the president, meaning that most of the time, the majority of votes goes to the candidate. That candidate then wins and becomes the president. That is how it has happened most of the time that elections have taken place.
Right. Now, there are 51 voting entities with electors in the United States, each state in the District of Columbia, or D.C., our capital. Historically, states have enacted a winner-takes-all system in which whoever receives the majority of votes in that state receives all of the state electors. So if presidential candidate A gets the majority of votes in Florida, then the electors will say, okay, we are going to vote for A because our people said they wanted A. And that's typically how it's gone. And then we say typically because there are several times where that has not happened.
And the other thing here is thinking about, like, you say that our people say we want candidate A, but what we mean by our people is that it just happens to be in the majority, not all of our people. So let's just say we had a state that had a whopping 20 electors. That's a lot of electors, by the way.
Right.
And 50.0000001% of the vote went to one candidate, where 49.99999% of the vote went to the other candidate. Let's just say there was a 1 vote difference. Let's just say that, just for fun, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter, because, I mean, they would, in this case, it would go to a recount usually in most laws. But let's just say that there was 1 vote, they were really confident in their count, and the 1 vote went to the one candidate, went in favor of the other candidate. Then what would happen is the candidate with that 1 extra vote would get all 20 electors, even though barely half the state supported that candidate, right?
Right.
And this gives rise to the idea of there being red states, Republican voting,
right,
and blue states, Democrat voting,
right,
in the country, because they would get all the electors, which means that state would then be described as belonging to that candidate, even if, again, they barely got half of the votes in that state. However, this system has been changed a little bit in 2 states. In 1972, the state of Maine decided to split its electoral votes using something called a congressional district method.
Ooh, interesting. In 1992 or 1996, I guess, maybe, Nebraska adopted the same strategy. In the congressional district method, 2 of the state's electors go to whoever wins the majority of the voters' choice, but the remaining electors are assigned to the candidate based on the majority of congressional districts. This could mean that the candidate gets all of the state's electoral votes if all congressional districts vote by majority for a single candidate, as has happened several times in these states. But this could mean that the state sends 2 electors to vote for the popular candidate for the state's voters, but sends additional voters to vote for the other candidate, which actually happened in 2008, 2016, and 2020.
Yes, they split their electoral vote. They're the only 2 states to do it. Now, I want to clear some things up because I know we have listeners who are not United States citizens. So for those outside of the U.S. who are still listening to this, I continue to say majority of votes and not just the most votes, as you might see in other democracies. This is because we only have 2 major political parties, in large part thanks to our electoral system, and we'll get to that later.
Right.
But it means that the majority of the time, there are only 2 viable candidates who are running for the position of president. In a system where there is a strong showing of other candidates, a candidate might win the presidency or whatever the position they're trying to get to is with only 30% of the vote, because the remaining 70% would be split among many other candidates. But one candidate did get the most votes, even if they didn't get a majority, and therefore they still won the election. In other democracies. In the United States, that's not how it works. They have to have a majority vote in order to win.
Right. So anyway, most of the time, the candidate supported by the majority of people gets the majority of votes and the majority of electors, and the U.S. has a bloodless coup in which they oust the previous sitting president and replace them with a new president with specific term limits. Actually, that part, the specific term limits, peaceful transitions, that's actually a pretty important part of our kind of the way that we think of our country.
Very important.
The last election did not do that.
Yeah. In the past, the alternative was to have the power of regimes change hands with not bloodless coups, but with violent coups where people were murdered, imprisoned, exiled, usually murdered, and also could be just generally stripped of their power in whatever way that happens. And that's how many other of these coups have taken place. But I think people have lovingly used the term bloodless coup to describe peaceful transitions of power where the people can alternate who is controlling a particular government at any one time.
Right.
Okay. There have been a handful of instances in the history of the United States in which the candidate with the most votes did not actually win the presidency with a system in place. So the first one was all the way back in 1824. And essentially what happened here, and we talk about this a little bit in our episode on when the two parties switched places philosophically. Essentially, there were 4 popular candidates on the ballot, all from the same party. I'm not going to list them all, but Andrew Jackson was one of them, and he actually won the plurality of the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. But, so like by this measure, he definitely should have won, right? But he didn't win the majority of votes, which was required, according to our Constitution, for him to become the U.S. president. So in this case, in the provision that they are not chosen by the majority of voters, the vote instead does go to Congress, as we talked about before. And that's what happened here. This meant that Congress got to decide on the outcome of the election. But when they do this, they only choose from the top 3 candidates. And as we mentioned, there were 4. The 4th candidate was Henry Clay. And so he was then removed from the decision pool of possible candidates. But he was still a powerful politician, and I believe at the time was Speaker of the House. And he used his political influence to back John Adams for president with the promise that Adams would make Clay the Secretary of State if Adams won. So what happened was Clay used his political clout to sway power away from votes toward Jackson, who had won the people's vote. And Adams was chosen despite having lost all of the votes in all the ways that matter. Of course, Jackson was furious at the insider bargaining and argued that the election was stolen from the will of the people. And I gotta say, he's not wrong.
Yeah, that's a pretty harsh thing, especially when it's like it doesn't really like from a very parsimonious perspective, it doesn't make sense. But also, how ironic that his last name is Adams, and we are at another ad break.
Okay, we're back. And so we've been recounting the history of instances in which the election in the United States chose a president who did not win the popular vote. The first one here in 1824, what happened was there were 4 viable candidates on the ticket. That was the last time that was going to happen, probably ever, at least until and if we ever move to a ranked choice voting system. But never mind. We're not here to litigate that election, or really any election for that matter. We're just recounting history. Okay, so that was 1824. In 1876, so we're now at, 52 years later?
Close enough. We're not a math podcast. We're a psychology podcast. We're talking about why we do what we do, not how we calculate what we calculate.
Fair enough. All right, so 1876, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes squared off against Democrat Samuel Tilden in an extremely contentious election. If you remember one of those names and not the other, then that will tell you how this election went. But let's just unpack this. Tilden won the popular vote, but he was 1 electoral vote shy of the nomination, which Hayes successfully obtained. Now, of note here, both candidates claimed Florida as a victory.
Of course.
Hayes, as a Republican, and this was following the Emancipation Proclamation, argued there had been several credible reports of voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement in Florida that prevented votes from being counted or even cast at all. Florida.
It's always Florida. Why is it always Florida? It can't ever be another state. It always has to be here.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. So just 12 years later in 1888, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison engaged in a gross campaign in which they would outright bribe citizens to vote for them. I wish I had the kind of money to bribe enough people to vote for me.
Yeah.
Like that feels like a lot of money.
They apparently described some of these citizens as floaters who like didn't care who the candidate was, that just whoever paid them the most, they would cast their vote for that person. So they were just happy to get paid, which I do understand, but also that should be wildly illegal.
Yeah.
Whoever's the richest candidate wins. Like that doesn't, no. Anyway.
Yeah, that's weird.
Okay, so this is 1888. Grover Cleveland here, he won over 90,000 more votes than Harrison, over 90,000, which should have been an easy victory. We're talking about the 1800s. We didn't have that many people here. Not even all of the states that we currently have were states at this time. So like 90,000 was a lot. He won by 90,000 votes, more than Harrison, but Harrison squeaked by with slim, tiny margins in other states, receiving more electoral votes than Cleveland, even though he lost the popular vote. Now, Cleveland did go on to beat Harrison in the next election and win the first and hopefully only instance of a president serving 2 non-consecutive terms. But the whole point is just that in this election, Cleveland won quite handily, 90,000 more votes than his opponent, but lost the election because of the Electoral College, where Harrison was able to secure those slim majorities in states where he then got all of the electoral votes in those states, even though he barely won them.
Right. Now, fortunately, we learned our lesson. We haven't had that issue since then, which is really nice, isn't it? Ugh, God. Okay, back to Florida. Just kidding. So in 2000, well, kind of just kidding.
Yeah, no, not kidding.
Not kidding at all. No, we're back to Florida, of course. So in 2000, George W. Bush lost the popular vote by a whopping 500,000 votes, which is basically the entire state of Wyoming at the time, right?
The size of it, yeah. I mean, Wyoming voted for him, but like, yeah, that's how many people were were over inside of Al Gore's. They voted for Al Gore.
Yes. But W won the electoral votes after a hotly contested dispute over the very confusing ballots and documented instances of voter suppression in Florida. Again, a whole thing. I remember when that happened.
I do too.
I can speak to that specifically. It was, dude, I never thought that I would have to use the term hanging chads. But like that was a big thing. Basically what was happening was some ballots were not counted because when they did the recounts, they said some of the ballots wouldn't count because the holes that were punched in the ballots were not completely punched. So the ballot was invalidated because of this hanging chad. Basically like the little paper hole.
A little piece of paper.
That was a little piece of paper that was still stuck to the ballot that basically said, no, these don't count. It's a hanging chad. So that's what the hanging chad was.
Yeah. They're like, our voting ballots are too fibrous. And so those people's votes don't count. The other thing that happened too, it'd be, God, it almost might be worth doing maybe a mini to unpack what happened in this election because this was a mess. But one of the other things that happened with the actual ballots, so never mind the voter suppression stuff, that is worth unpacking at some point also. But one of the other things that happened is like the ballots were laid out in such a way that sometimes the vote for the candidate you were voting for was underneath it was askew under the name it was supposed to be under. So it was unclear visually how you were supposed to select the candidate you wanted to. Because if the name wrapped around to a different line, for example, then it looked like you were voting for a different person. And there were very, very clear instances where people were confused about what they were supposed to do in that election. So with digital voting, that kind of issue has gone away and counting has become much more efficient and much more accurate. But that is what happened in 2000, at least.
Right. And then some other stuff that happened. The Florida State Supreme Court ordered a recount, but the U.S. Supreme Court halted the recount on the grounds that it violated constitutional voting rights and the electoral votes were assigned as is. Now, I also want to point out another thing that's super important to remember about all the stuff that was going on at that time. The governor of Florida was a man named Jeb Bush. Any
relation?
Would you wonder if he was related? Yeah, he was his f***ing brother. So like it was a cluster. It was an absolute cluster at the time. It was an absolute mess. And it was one of those things that was like my first the first time that I was so invested in politics because I was about that age where I'm like the next election I'm going to vote. And I was what is happening? Like I remember like just being so upset about it when it happened here.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the reasons Florida comes up a lot is because they do have a lot of electoral votes. There are a lot of people who live in Florida, so they
Yes.
carry a lot of weight in elections, and so it is important that the count can really, really sway the outcome of an election.
Yeah, Florida's considered a swing state. So like it historically has been Democratic or Republican kind of back and forth, despite the fact that our governor has mostly been a conservative candidate. Like it's considered swing state because we have so many like dense populous cities that sway the vote to a more left-leaning vote sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, so just going back to make sure we covered this. So in that 1888 election, Cleveland won with 90,000 more votes. At the time, that was a pretty significant amount of people. And then, 100 years later, more than 100 years later in 2000, we have this other instance where they win by an incredible 500,000 votes, which is more than 5 times as many people. And granted, the country had grown a lot by then, but 500,000 votes, as we said, is equal to the size of the entire state of Wyoming, at least around the time of the 2000 election. It's a little bit closer to 600,000 people in Wyoming now, but that's still so many votes. Okay.
Right.
Now, 16 years later, in 2016, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump with a staggering 2.8 million vote lead. 2.8 million.
Right.
Our population didn't grow that, so much between 2000 and 2016 that's a proportional number. That is the largest gap of all time, proportionally and otherwise.
Right.
2.8 million votes is so many. But Trump won in a few key states with very large elector pools, even though he had some tiny margins in some of those states, so that he was able to secure all of the electoral votes in states, even though he barely won by a majority. He just won in more states where there are more electors. And so even though he lost by a staggering number of actual votes from the majority, he ended up winning the electoral count and became the president.
Right. So I hope this is starting to kind of illuminate the issue, but we'll keep going. So even in the 2020 election, although Biden won the popular vote and the electoral vote, he won both. He won by more than 7 million votes, by the way.
Yeah.
7 million votes. And it was still considered a stolen election, which is hilarious. That's what people argue. Anyway, it was still considered a close election in which Trump still came close to winning because of the electoral votes.
Yeah. Even though he lost by 7 million votes. That is so many. That's so embarrassingly many.
It's a lot of votes.
That's a lot of votes. I'll tell you what, if you think that's not a lot of votes, let's just do a little exercise. You can pause the podcast if you want. Go and count to 7 million. Make sure you stay on track. And when you're done, come back and pick up where you left off. Uh-huh. And by the way, I might ask you to time yourself and see how long it takes. Okay.
I just want to kind of, on average, now that you've brought that up, I want to see how long it would take somebody to count to 7 million.
I've wanted to do a mini on this because I actually heard because we're so bad at large numbers.
Yeah.
As a species, it seems like. I heard someone describe this and it was kind of a staggering amount. Now, also consider just conceptually how long it would take to count you to 1,000. Now, how long it would take you to count to 1 million. Once you get to 1 million, you have to basically start over because you go 1 million and 1 million and 2, and you have to count to 1 million again 6 more times. So. Yeah, it's hard to wrap our heads around numbers that large. But yeah, go ahead and look it up. Let's see what you find.
So if you counted one number per second, which some of those numbers take a little bit longer to say in a second, but if you did one number per second with no breaks at all for any reason, sleep, eating, anything like that, it would take 11 days, 13 hours, 46 minutes, and 40 seconds to count.
To 7 million or to 1 million?
That is to 1 million. You're right. To 7 million, it's 7 times that.
Okay. So... So 77 days, more than 77 days, because it was 11 days. How many hours?
Oh, I exited out of the window. It's gone. It's
more than
it's
77 days to count to 7 million if you count one number per second. Good luck. We'll see you in 3.5 months. All right. 7 million is a gigantic number. Now, with the actually, hold on. This is a little bit early, but I just ask you to go count to 7 million. So let's while you do that, we'll let the ads play so that at least there'll be a little bit of time in between. Okay, we're back. With the you're on like 50.
Yeah, maybe.
That's all right. Just 6,999,950 left. All right. With the ever widening disparity between the popular vote and the candidate winning the election, there has been sort of a growing number of people calling to eliminate or just reform the Electoral College, with the National Archives reporting that there have actually been over 700 pieces of legislation to do just this over the history of this country. So some attempts have been made.
Yeah, there's some social validity there for sure. I mean, further, and this is desired by most people. So, like, this is not just like something that is desired by folks that have tried to legislate this. Most people actually agree with this. So, Pew Research polls found that in 1967, 58% of the people thought the Electoral College should be abolished. By 1968, it had risen all the way to 81%. It dropped to 75% in 1981. Still most of the people, by the way, by a huge margin. But it has started to become more political. Democrats now strongly favor elimination of the Electoral College, up to 89% in recent polls, whereas only about 30% of Republicans do. Taken together, public support has literally never been in favor of keeping the Electoral College for as long as people have been asked their opinion about it. At the lowest, it was 51%, but at the highest, over 80% in the last 25 years. It has pretty consistently remained over 60%. So, and I want to go back to those numbers in case we kind of blew through that. Most people want to abolish the Electoral College. Roughly, in recent polls, 89% of Democrats want to abolish it, but 30% of Republicans want to abolish it. I think that tells a little bit something here.
Yes. Yeah. The majority of people, and again, it has become a somewhat political issue for, I think, understandable is maybe not the right word, reasons that we can comprehend why people don't want to necessarily get rid of it. And we're going to unpack a lot of arguments for the Electoral College here in a moment, or at some point, maybe in a separate episode. But yeah, the majority of people throughout all of time that we've been asking people their opinion have wanted to get rid of the Electoral College. We know this is a bad idea, particularly when we granted suffrage to all people in the United States who were adults. It became increasingly obvious how bad an idea that it really was. And the reason to not have a popular vote, or the reason to have an electoral system in the first place, was at least due in part to believing that people were too stupid to be trusted with a vote, which is grossly cynical and deeply unfair.
Right.
And that's still kind of the reason, and we'll get to, that people want to keep the Electoral College. Although, weirdly, it's a little bit the opposite direction now, but we'll get to that later. Okay. Important question to ask, though, would be, first of all, could we get rid of the Electoral College? And second, what would be the system if we got rid of the Electoral College? And, I mean, it might seem fairly obvious to many people, but essentially, the general proposal is that we would just change to a popular vote, meaning that whoever gets the most votes wins the election. One person, one vote. Whoever gets the most wins. That would be the proposed alternative.
Right. So what arguments do people make in favor of keeping the Electoral College and in favor of abolishing it? It's similar to how we've done it in the past. I think we'll kind of probably come up with some arguments and stuff like that, but we might do that in another episode, I think, because it's so much to unpack. I don't know. How do you feel about that? Do you want to maybe like start tackling that for part 2?
Yeah, let's go ahead and pause this here and then probably come back for a part 2 where we'll discuss the arguments to keep the Electoral College and the arguments to abolish or revamp the Electoral College, if you will.
But I do want to kind of unpack this a little bit. So I want to go back to something to consider when you brought up the one vote, one person equals one vote. I think that on the surface is, to me, makes sense and definitely aligns with my values. So like, as we kind of unpack the rest of this, you will probably see that emerge. But I do think it's important to remember that just because somebody can vote doesn't mean that voting practices are equitable. And you just brought that up with Florida and the hanging chads and the ballots and how they were designed. So there is going to be probably some conversation around like, just because somebody can vote and they can get out and vote doesn't mean that the voting practices in their areas are equitable and allow them to vote. So if we do abolish a system where the Electoral College does not exist, then we do have to make sure that our voting systems do not actively suppress or disenfranchise specific groups of voters.
It's a very good point. Yeah, that again, and why there's probably a good reason to actually spend a whole episode going over things like voter suppression, because just as you said, just abolishing the Electoral College will not fix the other issues that could possibly arise and may even exacerbate some in terms of how elections are conducted, because there could be a greater emphasis on other voter suppression techniques that would try and disenfranchise people from participating in an election at all. Might be one tactic that is taken, or making it really difficult, or making it unfair, or using unreliable technology like paper ballots, but and hand counting,
or not giving people water while they're in line, or using military dressed up police officers to intimidate voters while they're in line, or putting up precincts that don't have handicap accessibility, or not making ballots something that is accessible to folks that are visually impaired, or making it
difficult to vote by mail, requiring people to vote in person, requiring people to vote in the middle of a work week is like a thing.
Right.
So like, yes, there are a lot of other issues we'll need to tackle to have the fairest, most evenly distributed system for voting. But eliminating the Electoral College or abolishing it would be one of the most impactful things that would happen right out the gate. Like that would result in some very radical changes very quickly.
Yes, and we will talk about all of that in the next episode on the Electoral College.
That would be such a lovely way to end this episode. But I'm going to do the thing that we always do, which is I'm going to go through our credits really quick. And also we're going to end by giving some recommendations, which is the thing that we do. Okay, so first, I would like to say, if you liked what you heard here today and would like to support us, you can join us over on Patreon. There, if you become a member, depending on the tier at which you join, you can get access to all kinds of things like bonus content, behind the scenes stuff, videos, etc., early episodes, ad-free episodes, that sort of thing, and the good warm fuzzy that comes with supporting a show like ours that tries to do our best to unpack these concepts in a way that is digestible to a large number of people, using our voices and our experience to do so.
Yeah.
You could support us also by picking up some merch. It's just, we've got stuff hanging out. We got mugs and t-shirts and hats and all kinds of goodies. So you can check those out, because nothing says cool like wearing podcast merch.
That's true.
Or carrying it around, I guess. But you can go get that stuff there. If you don't want to support us financially, you can always leave us a rating and a review. Those nice 5-star ratings and reviews help people find us. You can leave a rating without a review, but people do read reviews. So if you leave a nice positive review, people will find us. If you have something that you would like to criticize about what we have said, you can also email us directly. We'd love to have a constructive conversation with you. Our email is info@wwd.podcast.com. And of course, we're on social media platforms, at least some of them, and you can find us there. Other things, you can tell a friend. What am I missing? I'm missing some things.
You could vote for us to be the greatest podcast.
Oh, yeah. Voting does open next year. We actually just missed this year's, but you can. Anyway, you could vote for us. That could be a thing down the road. You can subscribe to make sure that we always show up in your feed, and that means that we're always around, and you can check out whatever episodes sound the best to you, or just listen to all of them, because we have such silky smooth voices, except when I stumble through things that I say, like I did just a second ago. Anyway, if you do go over and join us on Patreon, if that's one of the ways that you choose that you would like to support us, then I would like to just say thank you. Thank you to those people who have made that choice, who help us keep the show going. That is Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle. Thank you all very, very, very much.
Y'all are the best.
My team of people help me make this show, without whom this show would barely come out, if at all. That is writing and fact checking from Shane and myself. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. And if it sounds like we are two people having a conversation where you can understand our speech, it is because our audio engineer and producer, Justin, works his magic every time an episode comes out. I think that is it for credits, though. Let's go ahead and recommend some fun things.
Yay! I love that.
Recommendations.
All right, as I said, if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. And one thing that we do is at the end of every episode, we recommend something that we think is fun or whatever. I don't know. We just recommend something.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's movies because we like movies. Sometimes it's books because we like books. It's just sometimes it's a thing. Sometimes it's an activity. Right now, for me, it's going to be a movie. I am recommending a movie called Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. This is the 4th installment in the rebooted series of the Planet of the Apes. They have all, in my opinion, been very, very well done. The CGI on these is getting just incredible. This last one I thought was a really great story, very well executed, really impressive visuals. I love these movies. I think they're exciting, they're fun, they're interesting, they're well written, they're well shot. They tell really compelling stories. I just think they do a really good job with it, and it's a fun thought experiment on like a world without humans. I mean, not without humans, but where like another species is sort of taken over. And that's, I don't know. I just think there are other things that I think we can pack inside of this in terms of like, they get into things like how culture develops and kingdoms and politics and social commentary. And they're great movies. So you can check it out. At least I know at the time of this recording, it is available to stream on Hulu, but who knows where it'll be when you listen to this, if available at all. But if you're interested, go check it out.
Yeah, I've heard they're really good. I have not seen any of them, but I am excited to watch them because I know I've heard nothing but great things. So they're on my list of like movies I got to catch up on.
Fair.
All right. So let's talk about my recommendation, which is a band called Press Club out of Melbourne, Australia. I found this band just totally by accident on Spotify. It was one of those things where they showed up on a like weekly playlist type of thing. And they immediately hooked me, and I have not been able to stop listening to their full-length record, Late Teens, since I learned about this band. They are so good. It's a 4-piece, 2 guitars, bass, drums. It's guitar music if you like that kind of stuff. It's got kind of a pop punk poppy vibe, but like not like newer pop punk, more like you definitely hear like Ramones influences, like Green Day influences inside of it.
Oh, interesting.
Female vocalist, lots of fuzz on her vocals, which is really cool. And it's just super, super catchy. I mean, the minute that you like put Crash on, which is the first song on Late Teens, you are hooked. Like it just sucks right in. And it just is a nice, easy listen. The record's only 34 minutes. So It's worth checking out. I think if you like that sort of thing, it's very much so in that world.
Well, good job, Spotify.
Yeah, thanks for that.
That was Press Club as the band, the album Late Teens for you, and then Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was the movie I recommended. Okay.
Yes.
I think that is all we have to say for now. We're going to come back next time and we're going to unpack the arguments for and against keeping the electoral system as it exists. We'll have more recommendations at the end of that episode, but please catch us next time because I think this really gets into the overall meat of this discussion and the thing that we wanted to spend, I think, a lot of time making sure that we are really clear on where people are coming from on this issue.
Yes.
And it's already clear where we're sort of coming from, but it'll become increasingly so as we round out this discussion. But I think more importantly, you can make whatever choice you want for yourself. It's not like this is a thing that's going to change anytime soon. We'll talk about that, but we'll have, I think, a robust discussion.
Yes, most definitely. I'm really excited to get into it.
All right. Catch us next time. Thank you so much for listening. Do you have anything else to add or anything that I forgot? Shane?
Nope, nothing on my end.
All right, this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.